Good evening, everybody. We're going to let everyone just kind of give it a minute for everyone to come on in, and then we will get started. All right. Welcome everybody to Thinking Thursday. Tonight's topic is going to be anatomy and physiology. And so glad you guys could join us. If you could do me a favor, just so we have a sense of who's out there and like what division, so school, that kind of thing, could you put some information for us in the chat? And while you guys are doing that, it's my pleasure. I'm Dr. John Lohr. If you haven't attended a Workshop Wednesday or any of our webinar stuff, I work in the Science Olympiad National Office. But the real stars of the show tonight are our two presenters. And I will allow them to go ahead and introduce themselves and tell a little bit about what they're doing. And I'm sure you'll see why they're here tonight. So we'll kick it off with Phil because he's on top of my screen, and then we'll go to Ashwin.
Hi, everyone. I'm Phil Liu. I'm currently a biophysics PhD student at Stanford, researching antibody treatments targeting cancer.
Hey everyone, my name is Ashwin. I'm a fourth-year medical student at Virginia Commonwealth University, and I'm just happy to be here and help out.
They're both being modest, right? They've both been national event supervisors for anatomy and physiology. I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, you guys have both competed in this event during your time in Science Olympiad, correct? Right, so they got a wealth of experience behind them. For a couple of housekeeping details, this is being recorded, and let me make sure of that. Yep. So it's being recorded, and you guys will all get a recorded copy of the recording probably early next week after we do a little processing and editing for it. Second thing with regard to housekeeping, we definitely want to get to your questions and things that you're wondering about relative to anatomy and physiology. So please go ahead and use the chat, or the Q&A feature is probably best to type your questions in, and we'll kind of work through some stuff. I will say though, for this event though, our big focus is going to be on content questions. So if you've got little issues with the rules or things of that nature, this is not the forum for that. And you can always go through the FAQ system on the Science Olympiad website for rule specific questions. The focus tonight is really being on content. So on that note, I'm going to go ahead and stop, and Phil's got some stuff prepared that he's going to take you through, and we'll go from there. Hey, Phil, looks like you're muted, pal.
Oh, sorry. Hi, everyone. My name's Phil. I just have a couple slides giving a very broad overview of the AMP event for this year before we open up for Q&As. So just a quick overview of this year's systems. The three systems for the 2024 rotation covers the cardiovascular, lymphatic, and excretory systems. In terms of the cardiovascular system, I think the main important things to know are the parts and layers of the heart, how the blood travels through the pulmonary and systemic circuits, the heart's electrical system, and the genetics of blood typing. In terms of the lymphatic system is closely associated with the cardiovascular and immune system, which is involved in immunity so much so that a large portion of our white blood cells are actually known as lymphocytes, since they're the main type of cell found in the lymph. I think it's perhaps one of the tougher systems to study and find resources for, but in case students are wondering for resources outside of Google and review articles. Textbooks on immunology, I think hematopoiesis, and the cardiovascular system should cover most of your bases there, outside of, I guess, a more specialized textbook specifically focusing on lymphatics. And then finally, in terms of the excretory system, while we'd like you to know the structures and function of the kidney, ureters, bladder, and urethra, kind of like what's shown on the left, the main core of the system really involves the kidney and its functional unit, the nephron, as shown on the right, which on the macro scale allows for a regulation of blood pressure, osmolarity, and blood pH. Yeah, so this is just a really, I guess, high-level overview of the three systems, and I'm happy to answer questions on anatomy and physiology as a whole.
All right. Thanks, Phil. All right, the first one, we actually got one in the Q&A came in right away, and it isn't really content specific. It's more kind of like prepping for the event. And the question comes in is, do you have a recommendations on like creating notes and kind of preparing your resources and things for this event?
Yeah, so I guess I can answer and Ashwin can chime in. I think the best way to create notes, diagrams are pretty helpful. Anatomy and physiology, is pretty content heavy in terms of knowing where things are relative to each other, and labeling, I guess, the basic areas or potentially diagramming things out. That's pretty useful. In terms of notes, like most test-taking events, I would use lots of different colored pencils, or I guess colored pens, kind of to separate things out in terms of spatially organizing things. So it's not just the sheet of, very small black or grayscale print that you kind of have to hunt through in terms of a reference sheet.
Ashwin, you got any suggestions?
I think Phil nailed it. I guess one thing to add would be definitely take your time in preparing the note sheet, because I found as a competitor that the act of creating the note sheet was actually a really good way to review for the event. So a lot of it stays primed in your head.
Hey, I remember you and I talking, I think it was probably this summer. You had mentioned there's a software, there's a tool that you'd been using in medical school. I think it was Anki or something like that, that you found helpful reviewing. Would you can you
Yes,
talk a little
sir.
bit about that with these guys?
Yes, sir. Absolutely. Yeah. So Anki is a software that came out in the 2010s, if I remember correctly, used worldwide by medical students due to the huge abundance of material that needs to be memorized. The research-backed way of studying really well for a lot of material like anatomy and physiology, for example, is to use what's called spaced repetition, where you look at some content for the first time, let's say today, for example, and then I get I do flashcards for it today, and then I'll see those exact flashcards 2 days from now. And depending on how difficult it was for me to memorize certain cards versus not, it'll space them accordingly. So if there was a card that I had to look at 10 times to sort of understand, the computer algorithm would actually calculate that and give you the card maybe 3 days after that. But if it was an easy card that you got from the get-go, you might not see it again for 10 days after that. So it just really, really boils down to how you understand the information individually, and the program will take care of the rest, basically.
And now in the program, do you build your own unique set of cards, or is like kind of, I'm thinking like Kahoot, sometimes you can find people that, hey, I've built a set of quizzes and I just share them and make them available.
Yeah, so there's a large repository on the Anki webnet of a lot of pre-made decks, but that's more for higher level clinical knowledge, I would say. For the levels for Science Olympiad specifically, would have to make your own cards. And oftentimes that's a better way to learn anyways, because you can sort of modulate how you want to word the cards, or you can focus on your specific weaknesses and tailor the cards towards what you need.
All right. Okay, this question comes in from Heidi. And she asks that how do kidney hormones and blood osmolarity affect the cardiovascular system? And thinking in terms of blood pressure, blood volume, those kind of things.
So that really involves the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. I think if you there's plenty of medical textbooks and on renal physiology and that cover that. Primarily, the kidneys filter a large portion of the blood at every pass. I think about a fifth of the blood is actually filtered into the kidneys for processing. And then the kidneys secrete hormones such as renin, which later downstream activate a series of other pro-hormones, ending up with angiotensin 2. And then from there, that involves vasoconstriction in terms of uptake of different ions, and that ultimately affects blood pressure. Ashwin, I don't know if you want to chime in. We can fill in more details if there are, I guess, follow-up questions to that.
Sure, I think you gave a really good overview. If there's any further questions that are going to be asked, I'm willing to help.
Let's see. Okay. So we're getting a couple of questions around this issue of studying for the diseases, right? And here's the probably the more specific version of the two is, do you guys have any resource suggestions for disease symptoms and identification? It seems to be, this is from a coach, that's what the kids seem to be struggling the most is understanding the diseases.
Yeah, sure. So I think I can speak from a medical student standpoint. There are some resources that we use that are very good. There's a book called Pathoma, which is a really good book for sort of talking about the cellular level pathophysiology for a disease. So, for example, if you have atherosclerosis, it's going to talk you through like, okay, what's happening on the molecular level, which is causing this to happen in the arteries. But then if you want to look for more of the clinical sort of presentation, there's another book that we use in medical school called First Aid for the USMLE, which is our licensing exam that we have to take. There's a step 1 and a step 2 version of the book. And both of them are pretty good at sort of detailing the symptomatic presentation of the disease in question and variations in how common that those certain symptoms can be. And they also talk about the epidemiology. So it doesn't differ between men and women, looking at age as well. So those are some good resources. And if you go to any, I used to do this a lot when I was in high school. I used to go to the used bookstore a lot, and there's a lot of clinical books you can find in the clinical section about diseases too that are, beyond what I just mentioned. So there's plenty of resources out there.
Yeah. Ashwin, have you ever used, or Phil, back in the day, I remember there was in the bookstore, there was always like these laminated 2-side sheets. Sometimes they were maybe a 4 pages, what it's just like a set of notes on different diseases or different topics, like, hey, here's everything you need to know about calculus, or here's everything you know about optics. Do such things, have you ever seen those for like at medical school or in your studies? And if so, have you ever checked them out?
I know what you're talking about, and I used them a lot when I was in high school. I had them for calculus, like you mentioned, and I did have some for when I was doing this event 9 years ago, and it was primarily for anatomy. So you would see the musculoskeletal system for one whole page, and then the next page would be digestive organs, things like that.
Okay.
I would definitely second. In terms of, there are definitely, I guess, for anatomy, there's definitely reference textbooks. But usually for, I guess, diseases of particular systems, each each book would have probably be dedicated to one system. So for the excretory system, you'd probably want to find like a renal physiology book would probably get into a bit more of the aspects of what you're interested, what the students would be interested in.
Right. Okay, guys, this one comes in the chat from Lakshmi, and she's asking, what is the best resource that you guys could think of for the lymphatic system? Is there a good place to go to find good details about that?
Yeah, there was a book I used when I was a student doing Science Olympiad, and I've oftentimes referenced it during medical school as well. It's called Anatomy and Physiology by Gerard Tortora, and they have a really good section in there on the lymphatic system that gives a really good overview from top to bottom. And I can also type these books out in the chat if that's okay, so people can just know what they're called and whatnot.
Absolutely. All right. And while Ashwin's doing that, let me question here in the Q&A of it says, besides electrical waves that are sent through the heart, right? Are there any electrical waves or things that they should know about that go through the kidney or bladder? You guys think of anything like that? I mean, because there is, as far as I know, I can't think of anything, you know, that.
Well, other than like understanding like smooth muscle contraction, I think the heart's fairly unique in that we like in terms of what we would want students to study is really the pacemaker tissues of the heart and how that involves with contraction. In terms of well, like there's electrical activities in, I guess, involved in the excretory system in terms of, I guess, muscle tone and control, but I don't think that's necessarily. I'd be surprised if, I guess, that would be tested as part of the excretory system for Science Olympiad. I don't know if Ashwin has any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I second that. Primarily, if you're looking at electrical waves, it's primarily the heart and the nervous system. But when it comes to the kidneys and bladder, like Phil said with the smooth muscle, a lot of systems are intertwined with one another. So you do need to have nervous system input into the kidneys and bladder to be able to modulate, glomerular filtration rate, for example, or even the filling of the bladder and the emptying of it. So that's probably the extent to which electrical waves are involved.
Is it safe to say, guys, that as you're doing your research and as you're doing your prep, you can find a lot of stuff about these systems that like seem fascinating and seem really important, but ultimately they're like too specific or too detailed to show up on a Science Olympiad test?
Oh yeah, for sure, and especially I think at the regional level and even at the state level, a lot of times the goal is understanding primarily the system, and obviously, like a lot of the systems are interrelated. So if you study the lymphatic system, you'll inevitably study a bit of the immune system, but we're not going to be testing immune system concepts like the complement system on a test on the lymphatic system. So like there's no need to like delve into that side. Like you can easily rabbit hole your way into an entirely different system if you go to, if you kind of find something interesting and all of a sudden it takes you to completely different set of like a different area outside of the rules. But definitely, I think the main goal is we tried our best with the rules to kind of put out key phrases that if you enter into Google that offers I would say a pretty good starting spot in terms of figuring out the rough areas, kind of the high yield areas of where to study.
Right. And I would, so this goes to someone that typed a question here in the Q&A about the relationship between immune system and lymphatic system. They asked, should they also be studying the immune system? And I think, as Phil said, no, you need to understand that there is a relationship between the two, but pretty much after that, you do not need to worry about the specifics of the immune system for this year's test. All right. This one I'm going to throw to the our medical student here. Student wants to ask, what happens if all 4 heart valves are shut?
Yeah, that's a good question. So generally, during the cardiac cycle, when your atria and ventricles are contracting, and this happens for all of us in this chat every second, there will be times during the cardiac cycle where all 4 valves are shut. And that's usually during what's called an isovolumetric phase, whether it's for contraction or relaxation of the ventricles. So if you're trying to shoot, if the left ventricle, for example, or the right ventricle are trying to shoot blood out through the aortic and pulmonic valves, before those valves can open, the contractions of those of the cardiac walls needs to generate an intra-chamber pressure that's high enough to exceed the pressure that's in the aorta, for example, because the aortic valve is not going to open unless the left ventricular pressure can overcome the aortic pressure. So, but before that happens, all 4 valves are shut.
Okay. So it's something that, if I'm understanding you right, it's something that regularly happens, but it's not, because it regularly happens, it's not really a bad thing. It's just part of the normal cycle of the heart opening and closing.
Yes, sir. It happens constantly throughout the day with every single heartbeat.
Okay. All right. Then sticking with the heart, Piyush, I hopefully got that right, asks in the chat, how can you correctly identify different types of diseases in an ECG?
Yeah, so there's many different kinds of, so I guess the better way to phrase it would be, there are, for a lot of pathologies on the heart, there are a lot of variations that will happen in the ECG that will stray away from normal. So generally, if your question is how to correctly identify the different types of diseases, there are resources out there that can really help with learning how to identify these things. Because with ECGs, a lot of it is just repetition and like practice. There is actually a very good pre-made Anki deck that does cover that medical students use, but I'm sure that there's other resources as well on the internet if you were to Google. So what I did when I was in Science Olympiad was I used to go to Google Images, and if I was curious about how atrial fibrillation looked on an ECG, I would just Google atrial fibrillation on an ECG strip, and it would result in a multitude of like different pictures that could help you to see different variations of how it could look.
Definitely second that. I guess there are definitely like ECG, EKG reference sheets that are floating around online. But I would say ultimately it boils down to a lot of it is pattern recognition. And like if you get exposed to enough of it, if you see an ECG, like you'll be able to identify it.
Yeah, so I mean, thinking about it from a learning standpoint, the better you understand what a normal pattern looks like, then the easier it's going to be to identify sort of the changes in the waves or the changes in the pattern. And then it's like you said, Phil, it's like matching up those changes to specific kind of diseases and that. I will say, okay, so Ashwin just added one. I gotta look, I'm gonna have to look for it, but we used to have there was a website that was an EKG kind of simulator EKG training tool that we actually linked to the Anatomy and Physiology page. That might be worthwhile if we can find that one again. And the other resource I would point out to you is a lot of this focus I think anatomy and physiology ends up, like, we're thinking doctors, right? And clearly we got a medical student here, we got a graduate researcher, but don't forget resources for nurses, as well as looking for things for paramedics as well. Paramedics spend a ton of time looking at EKGs, and they have a lot of stuff like that to help them learn the patterns and recognize things. And before we get off, this quick question, and I know it's kind of spelled out in the rule book, right? If they are looking to figure out the ECG, EKG patterns, they really should be looking at 3A2, right? Because it spells out the lethal and non-lethal patterns, and there is a difference between division for middle schoolers and high schoolers on what patterns you need to understand.
Yep. In terms of the EKG patterns, it's definitely 3A2. I think it's subsection 1, and division C is expected to know all the division B patterns in addition to the ones that are listed. Yeah.
All right. So let's see. I'm trying to figure out where to go next. Let's jump over. I'm going to read it as it is, and I think there might be a typo, but there's a question here about inulin being included in the glomerular filtration rate.
Yeah, I would say in terms of the glomerular filtration rate, creatinine and understanding both the creatinine clearance and also using inulin would be, I guess it's something competitors would know or should know. I guess whether or not it appears, is up to different competitions and different event supervisors. But I think it's something that I guess is covered under the rules.
Okay. Yeah, that I think is an important point you kind of put there. Everyone should keep in mind the fact that while these guys have experience and they run this event and they've competed in this event, there are over 450 different Science Olympiad tournaments in any given season. So it can be difficult to predict exactly what's going to happen at any one tournament, or how any one person is going to take a look at this stuff. Before we jump to the questions, there's just one in the chat I want to tackle about, like, how do you know what to study for each system? And guys, correct me if you think I'm wrong, but it really comes down to the rules. And I got to give credit to these gentlemen because they were part of the process, but the entire biology team, because I think in anatomy and physiology is one of the best events at breaking down what you need to know for what type of competition, whether it being states, regionals, nationals. They do a pretty good job of flagging the different content, and they also do a really nice job of identifying what middle schoolers need to know versus what high schoolers need to know. But the other, I guess, resource we can throw out there for this is if that's a concern of yours and like trying to see how other people think of the rules, probably one of the best places to go if you haven't already visited is SciOly. It's the student-to-student forum and wiki, and they have a test exchange. And you can find, I'm sure at this point, probably decades of old anatomy and physiology stuff out there to see different questions and to see what different tests look like at different levels.
Then in terms of soinc.org, I think there are a couple of practice tests from or invitationals earlier this year that are also hosted on. So that's a pretty good resource in terms of, if you don't want to do test exchanges and stuff, those tests are available, on soinc.org.
All right. So this one, as we sit there and we get into the weeds, got a question here about glomerular filtration rate calculation and creatine clearance. So what is expected of students in Division B? They go on to say that there are different methods like CKG and EPI, and sometimes questions don't have all the, so depending upon the method, I guess they've seen questions where there isn't all the information you need to calculate the clearance. Any thoughts or ideas on that one, guys?
Yeah, so when it comes to the GFR calculation, we're not really, the event's not trying to go for specific methods, if that makes sense, that have been done in the past based on research. We're just looking at like simple, creatinine clearance is a simple formula, and it should be in one of the notes sheets that's on the Swank website, I believe. At least it was there when I was a competitor. But basically, given the equation that was on there, which I believe has to do with, you have to know what the urine creatinine is, and you have to know the volume of your urine in milliliters per minute. And then you have to know the serum plasma creatinine concentration as well. Generally, questions will deal with the equation where it's CRCL, or creatinine clearance, is equivalent to the urine creatinine times the volume of the urine divided by the serum over the plasma creatinine. And that will result in a pretty good approximation of your GFR. But outside of that methodology, I don't believe that would be within the rules.
Okay. All right, so here's one, and they're going off of a specific experience. So I'm assuming these guys, they say they're at regionals, which I mean, early state regional there. Question where they had to find the correct heart pressure values for specific diseases. Is there an easy way to either do those calculations, or are there like easy ones to know, like clearly this is gonna, this disease always impacts heart pressure, like your blood pressure or the pressure in the heart?
Yeah, so that has more to do with valvular disorders, which, if I do recall from looking at the rules, that's going to be more of a Division C nationals only, or states or nationals only, because it includes heart conduction disorders and valvular heart disorders. And I think a good example of a valvular disorder, just to illustrate how these pressures can change from normal in the left ventricle, for example, is if you have what's called aortic stenosis, which basically means that when your aortic valve opens, it doesn't open all the way. And instead of being really patent and allowing blood to flow from the left ventricle to the aorta, it's much more narrowed. So it becomes stenotic. And as a result, if you look at the pressure volume loops for the heart, for example, the left ventricle's the pressure loop would actually become more narrow and a lot higher. Because the ventricle has to push a lot harder to get all the blood out to be able to send it to the rest of the body. So if that's what the question is referring to, if you look up pressure volume loops and valvular disease in Google, there's probably going to be a couple of good resources that could help with that.
Okay. But Ashwin, from your standpoint and thinking of it, it's almost more often than not, if there's an issue with kind of heart pressure, right? Or it's going to be because there's a valve disease or a valve issue.
Yes, sir. For the most part, it's due to valvular issues.
Okay. So hopefully that helps you kind of narrow it down and think about it, that that if you're seeing this, you should be cluing into the fact that something's going on with the valves. Right. Okay, here's an interesting one, and it's very broad, so I'm kind of hoping you guys could maybe point them in a couple of different directions. But the question comes in is, so what's some vocabulary that the kids should know and keep track of? Not so much in terms of the content of the event itself, but like things to help them understand the question. So the one that immediately, at least in my mind, I start thinking about like anatomy when you start talking about like, oh, it's posterior, it's anterior, some of those kind of things. Like, is there some general vocab that they want to make sure they understand and know about?
Yeah, I mean, I would say a lot of anatomy and physiology comes from Latin and Greek roots. And so like if the main broad stuff is if you know like you might see like hemo meaning blood, and stuff like that. It's just knowing those roots will probably help you a fair bit in terms of even just kind of guessing what the question is asking if it's a complicated word. Um, it, a lot of, I think ultimately though, a lot of it is fairly memorization heavy. I don't know if Ashwin has better tips.
Yeah, I think Phil nailed it. It's a very memorization and experiential heavy. Admittedly, a lot of medical terminology was sort of something I learned over the years. I didn't really use a specific resource to learn. But like John mentioned, knowing the very fundamental sort of Latin-based terms. So, for example, anterior, posterior, the alternative terminology like ventral, dorsal, knowing the anatomical planes, where you have a sagittal, coronal, longitudinal, etc. Those are probably the big ones to know. And as the students read their resources and do the event and learn more about the different diseases and the different physiological processes, they'll be exposed to enough terms that they'll be able to understand that on competition day.
Yeah, because correct me if I'm wrong, Ashwin, it's because it's been a long time since I actually had to get through an anatomy and physiology class. But there's really, when you think of the body, they're always thinking of like in two dimensions, sort of. So there's like we were talking about front and back, like anterior, posterior. So, but then you also think about, am I kind of cutting the body in half through like, cutting my legs off from my torso, or am I like splitting the body down the middle from head to toe, right? That's what you're kind of referring to when you're talking about the planes.
Yes, sir. So you have one like this, you have one like this, and you have one like this.
Yeah, I totally forgot about the left and right. So that may be, I mean, if your kids are struggling with accessing some of that stuff, that may be a good place to start and making sure they're clear about those terms and the relationships where you may find things. And then Phil had a great point. And you usually can find like little cheat sheets, or there'll be, Latin roots in medicine. So the point about, that hemo is always referring to blood, or those kind of things may end up helping. Um, excuse me with my cough here. So this one's getting into specifics on the excretory, and I'm gonna probably butcher the second one, but they want on getting into, will they have to know, or will they be expected to worry about cortical versus juxtamedullary nephrons, or in particular the juxtaglomerular apparatus?
I would say the juxtaglomerular apparatus is pretty essential in the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. So yes, yeah, I think it's important to know.
And when it comes to the nephrons, also, I would say for the cortical and the other type as well, the two of them are. It's a good test question to be asked, probably at a higher level, probably a state or national level, I would say, because one of those types of nephrons is actually more essential for concentrating the urine than the other. So that's the key distinguishing factor between both of them. So I'm not saying it'll definitely get asked, but it could be asked. So it would be good to review that as well.
But you also would say that that's is that more thinking? I'm trying to think of a good analogy here. It's not necessarily an essential point, right? Like, I mean, obviously there's some fundamentals about nephrons that if you don't understand the loops, if you don't understand structure, like you're really going to be in trouble. But the difference between one type of nephron and the other is kind of a further out piece of information, right?
Yeah, it's a more it's not as much of a fundamental concept as how the different parts of the nephron work, but it's essential from looking at it from a urine production standpoint. I think it's important, but that's something that you would learn deeper into learning this. It wouldn't be a fundamental concept.
Yeah. All right. Let's see. We've kind of touched on that. And this one's pretty broad, but I'm trying to see, so they're asking the question, right? What are the most important things to know about the lymphatic system? And they're thinking about it at a very basic level. Outside of the basic structures and some of their functions that are named in the rules, anything else jump to mind that's sort of a big deal to pay attention to with the lymphatic system?
Yeah, I would say one really important thing that my coach back in sixth grade really stressed on with the lymphatic system is because we had it with the cardiovascular system back then too. Know that the cardiovascular system can be a bidirectional pathway, but the lymphatic system only moves in one direction, if that makes sense. So all the lymph is constantly moving in one direction, and you don't have different types of circulation like the venous circulation or the arterial circulation. So that's a very big fundamental idea about the lymphatic system.
All right. Coming back to, and this is going to test your guys' knowledge. Some questions about the loop of, and here's my eyesight. It's Henle, right? So in the nephron. Like, so what? Can you talk a little bit about like what's its function and what kind of things it's filtering or doing in the process of clearing the blood?
Yeah, so I guess one really fundamental idea to get used to first about the loop of Henle is that there's two major parts of it that have slightly different functions. So there's a for the descending portion of the loop of Henle, it's the thin descending portion. And then the ascending portion, which is the part that's coming up, is thicker, has more mitochondria. So you have a lot more active transport happening there versus in the descending loop that's thinner and you have more passive transport. And the role of the thin descending loop of Henle is to passively reabsorb water. And that's due to the hypertonicity of the medulla of the kidney, which is the inner portion, because the loop of Henle is dipped down into the medulla area. And it's important to know that that part of the thin descending loop is impermeable to water. So it's passive reabsorption of water, basically. And and we call that the concentrating segment because it makes the urine more hypertonic because you're removing all that water, but you're not removing salt to go with it. And then for the thick ascending portion, it'll reabsorb sodium, potassium, and chloride. It can also indirectly reabsorb magnesium and calcium because when you bring potassium over from the thick ascending portion into your interstitial space, you're making the urine a little bit more negative. And as a result, that can actually cause really cause the or I'm sorry, basically I had that mixed up. Apologies. So because so you bring your potassium into the interstitial, but then that potassium actually leaks back into the urine, making it more positive. And because magnesium and calcium are positive, they get reabsorbed as well. And as a result of all these different ions coming out of the urine there, it makes the urine less concentrated as it ascends. So that's the primary function in terms of what's absorbed versus what's not absorbed in both parts.
And I'd like to just add on real quick about like it essentially that loop acts. There's a idea called like counter current multiplier, and in which case, like through the exchange of water and ions as the filtrate goes down and then back up, you essentially get I guess increased absorption or reabsorption of nutrients and water.
Okay. So here is again, sticking kind of with the excretory system. We've talked a lot about the kidney, and obviously I think everyone would agree the kidney's sort of the diva of the show, right? Where the part everybody you really got to understand. After that, is there another part of the system that the kid should be really paying attention to in terms of diseases or questions, or you mean overall importance and function?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would obviously spend most of my time on the kidney, but the rest of the system is still important, the urethra and bladder. I think the rules do test UTIs, if I remember correctly. Yes, they do. So that's something that I think that's a disorder that students should be aware of and understand where in the body that plays and how that can affect the system. So for sure, definitely, I would spend for excretory system, I would spend, at least half, if not more, of my time on the kidney, but I wouldn't neglect the other parts as well.
And I mean, not to diminish its importance, but in a lot of ways, the bladder's pretty basic, correct? In terms of what its role is and how things are going to play out with in terms of the overall system.
Yeah, I would say that definitely the big piece of pie is definitely the kidney, and the really important thing also is that because the bladder is connected to the kidney through the whole urethral through the ureters and that whole part of the system. If any of the fluid backs up, that can actually damage your kidneys too. So as a result, that's why a UTI, for example, can be very damaging to the kidney as well. It can go from urethritis to cystitis to pyelonephritis, and that's within the rules as well. So I would say the bladder can really be important in that regard from a disease standpoint.
All right. Let's see what else we got here. All right. I'll take this one. Molly's asking a question about bone marrow. No, Molly, you are good this year. We are not going to, no one should be asking about bone marrow. And let's see, there's. All right. Here's a interesting one. So they're asking about, long story short, that, obviously on the tests, diagrams are a big deal, right? And particularly in an event like Anatomy and Physiology, diagrams are going to be a big deal. Not every tournament do you get really good diagrams, right? They're not necessarily all the clearest, or the quality can vary a little bit. Do you have recommendations in terms of like a source outside of the ones you've already shared, where like, hey, these are the kind of diagrams you want to be looking at, or this is, I mean, if someone's pulling a diagram, they're more than likely getting it from this textbook.
Yeah, there's a really good resource that often gets pulled for anatomy pictures, and it's even good for reviewing for the diagrams. It's called it's an anatomy atlas by an author called Netter. I can put that in the chat. This is a tried and true, very, very good atlas.
Perfect. So if you're looking for images, or you want to increase your odds by looking at a common source of images, check out Netter's Anatomy Atlas. Okay, here's an interesting one. Relative to diseases, and now this is, I'm kind of curious if this actually fits in anything we have. How do you identify diseases based on the appearance of the urine? The example they give is such as, protein in the urine is going to change color. Do we really get into using the urine as a diagnostic tool?
For the event, not too much. Really, if we're really talking about making diagnostic sort of decisions off of urine, it's doing a culture of the urine to see if there's an infection. So I guess a urine culture could be relevant for a UTI. And for kidney stones, you can actually look at the urine under a microscope to actually look at the crystallization and how it looks under the microscope to determine what specific kind of kidney stone it is. But in terms of urine color, I think outside of like maybe a few drugs that can cause your urine to be orange, or if your muscles break down, it can cause you to have cola-colored urine. Those are beyond the scope of the event.
All right. Okay, real quick. Asher was putting some stuff in the chat. Looking back at it, they may not have all been going out to everybody, but that's all right. I will make sure when we send out the link to the recordings, we'll get you guys will have all that information he shared there. And if I can get away with linking to it directly from the event pages on the Science Olympiad website, we'll also get that taken care of. So there's some resources and things up there for you. I want to, let's see if we got a, all right. Do we have, okay, we kind of touched on this one before, but guys, correct me if I think I'm going to get this one right. When they're talking about the GFR, right? There's really only one specific kind of approach that Ashwin talked about. You don't really have to worry about a ton of other calculations or other methods. And you could check back here in the webinar if you missed it earlier, but it really just had to deal with, you need to know some things about serum volume, kind of the rate, and then the amount you were starting with. So it's a fairly straightforward rate calculation. So you don't need to get any complex questions.
I think at best it'd probably be like the questions that are asked would be like arithmetic, like addition, subtraction, division stuff that they can compute. I don't think it would like those would probably be the levels of formulas that we would expect them to know in terms of calculating filtration rate.
All right. So now we got someone coming back at me on the question about bone marrow. And they say, shouldn't they be studying bone marrow for the lymphatic system and hematopoiesis? But I don't, just taking a quick look at the rules, I don't think we really get into that, do we, in the lymphatic system?
Yeah, so the bone marrow is involved with the lymphatic system, but I don't think it's the primary emphasis in terms of its relation with the immune system. I think it would be the germinal centers in the lymph nodes alongside the thymus and its involvement in terms of like maturation. So in terms of really understanding, I guess in terms of a broad overview, I think students it would be good for students to understand that the bone marrow is kind of involved with the lymphatic system, but I would not expect them to study like hematopoiesis is like it can be an own field onto itself, and I would certainly not expect students to kind of go down that path. We don't really address that. That's kind of beyond the scope of the rules.
All right. All right, on that note, I think we're right at time. So I want to say thank you to the guys for doing this and taking time out of their busy schedule and their schoolwork and everything to spend some time helping us out. And say thank you to everybody. Hopefully you got some useful information out of this. As I said at the start, we've recorded this. Everyone will get a link to the recording. We are going to go ahead and I will get pull the information from the chat. So you have the recommended resources and the links. You'll get to see that. And we really didn't answer any type answers for questions. So there's really nothing. If you want questions answered, you want to hear the questions that were asked, you kind of got to scroll through the video. So I wish you guys the best on the rest of your season. Hope we run into you at a tournament somewhere. And again, have a great night and thank you for spending some time with us.